Hey, Dave Melenda here, Positive Polarity Podcast. Hope you're doing awesome. I got a word this week that I want to unpack with an amazing person. I'm super stoked. And the word is really intimidating for me. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to unpack this week. Before I get to the word, I want to introduce the awesome person. It's Dr. Julia Sloan. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited. You're in New York, so thank you so much for hanging out with a little guy here in the Midwest. So we're honored to
Oh, thank you for having me.
absolutely. So Sloan International Consulting. I'm also super excited because I wish I would have put international in my wording somewhere. I love the fact that it's Sloan International Consulting. And so looking at your all the places that you've been and taught, and oh my gosh, we're going to get into a bunch of that. So thank you so much for again hanging out. The word that we want to talk about today is strategy. And when I think of that word, there's all these images in my mind, and it kind of goes back to when I was a kid, and my dad would always want me to play chess. And he knew all the strategies, right? And they were so complicated, and he was like 6 or 7 moves ahead, and I just couldn't deal with it. So I'm like, forget it, I'm done. So I had this negative connotation, on strategy. So I want some help from you on that. And you said what I really liked, and we'll unpack this, is you said that you like to strip away the confusing jargon that's around strategy. So why don't we
Yeah.
start out by you sharing with me and the audience, what is your definition of strategic thinking? When you think of those words, what comes to your mind?
Well, there are lots and lots of definitions of strategic thinking, of strategy, strategic planning. And unfortunately, what happens is these words have tended to get jumbled and garbled,
Yeah.
and people tend to use them interchangeably. And I think that does nothing but cause confusion. So
Sure.
what I've done is, as a result of years and years of research, is I've tried to strip away some of that jargon and garbly stuff, and I've constructed a model that takes a look at strategy, but it
Okay.
divides it into three very distinct what I call domains. So
Okay.
one is strategic thinking, one strategic planning, and one is strategic implementation. And the way that I look at these is based on the underlying kinds of thinking that support each one. And so for strategic thinking, I look at strategic thinking as being an approach to strategy that is very distinctly different from strategic planning and implementation,
Okay.
because the focus of strategic thinking, surprisingly, is actually on the problem, not the solution. And this is the first point of clarification: is what's the intent of
Okay.
strategic thinking? And the intent of strategic thinking is to focus on the problem, to say, do we have the real problem and do we have the right problem? Because I'm guessing many of your listeners are probably saying, yeah, this happens to me all the time at work. Is
Yep.
somebody plops a strategy on my desk and says, here, go implement it. And as I start to look at this strategy, people just say, but this isn't the real problem, or but this isn't the right problem. And so what happens is we very rarely take the time to take a look at the problem, to say, do we have the real problem and do we have the right problem? So that's the intent and the purpose of strategic thinking.
So we
Also,
start with so just so I'm going to clarify that for myself. So because I wrote down like problem right after strategic thinking. So strategic thinking is
perfect.
looking around and trying to understand we have an issue, we have a problem. And so that's our first thing, is to identify
Yes.
what that is. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Because I
And
just,
to say, is it really the right problem? And is it the real problem? Because people in organizations, people in small businesses, people in who are solopreneurs, people who are in corporations, we all tend to we sit in somewhere in the organization, and we tend to have our own perspective of the problem that could be very, very different than 1,000 other people in the
sure.
company, or 2 other people. So we really want to focus on that problem and really dissect it. And so I always say, strategic thinking is problem focused and problem driven.
Okay.
I think that's one of the hardest things, is to push the pause button and try to pull yourself back from solving the problem.
Okay.
And we're in strategic thinking, or we're in strategy season right now.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
A lot of people are experiencing the same thing of just, I always say, strategy itself is just this big eyeball rolling exercise that a lot of us go through. And I think when we can break it down into these three parts of saying strategic thinking, strategic planning, and strategic implementation, it just makes it so much easier to digest.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, and so now I have a question, because that really brings up, I think something, I'm sure somebody's thinking about this right now, is that if there's different perspectives on the team about the problem, one person thinks this is the problem, another person thinks that this is the problem. They can both be right, but how do you really poll the team, and how do you come to consensus in that situation? Because I got to believe if you have 10 problems, you're almost doing a think, planning, and implementation for each one of those problems. So how do you get everybody to kind of get on the same page with that?
This is so hard. This is so common, and it happens all the time. And I think my recommendation is, to really, as a leader, to really push the pause button and say, we're going to push the pause button. We're going to take a look and examine the problem, okay, and hear everybody out. I think so many times with strategy, we completely omit strategic thinking. People assume, they make this assumption and they act on the assumption that everybody sees the problem, or everybody should see the problem in the same way I should. And then we move instantly, just real quickly, we move into solutions. And this is why you end up with, research has shown between 91 and 93% of strategic plans never reach implementation.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
91 to 93%. So you wonder why people are rolling their eyeballs during strategy season. It's because they've been there. They've been there, done this before. And it's really the absence of strategic thinking, where people don't spend the time to say, let's move into what I call the 2Ds of strategic thinking, which are divergent thinking and deep dive thinking, to really say, as a leader, I always say a water balloon. I'm going to take my strategy like a water balloon, and I'm going to walk it around and shop it around and invite people to really poke holes in it. The whole purpose of strategic thinking is just that, to invite people to poke holes in your water balloon, to say, does this thing hold water? And you will get lots and lots of people who will say, no, it doesn't. I mean, look what happened when I poked it. And you go to another department or another section or another place in the world, and people say, yeah, it doesn't hold water here either. Wow. And that's an indicator. It's kind of shaking out, your marbles. Yep. That's just so difficult for leaders to do.
So that also brings up another thing of, like, now I have to set my ego aside here,
Oh, thank you.
Julia, right? Come on now. I own this place. Now I got to let you poke holes in my thoughts. I mean, now we're starting to get a little.
Right? Thank you for bringing that up. Now I don't have to.
Yes.
This is one of the things, when we look at characteristics and traits and attributes, or whatever you want to call it, of strategic thinkers. One of the things about strategic thinking is it's highly emotional. And this really runs contrary to what we teach in business schools. It really runs contrary to what we teach in exec ed courses. It really runs contrary to what we read. People always say, a really good strategic plan should be devoid of emotion. Well, that's strategic planning. But my research works on the strategic thinking piece. Strategic thinking is highly emotional. And a lot of it is getting rid of that ego of saying, and this is where I say, you need to go back and take a look at the model of strategy to say, what mode am I in? Am I leading my team in strategic thinking,
Sure.
or strategic planning, or strategic implementation. If you're deliberately in strategic thinking mode, it's all about emotion. And this is what I think courage is one of the things that I find to be most difficult for leaders around strategic thinking.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Who wants to walk in their idea that they think is the best and share it with people and allow them to poke holes in it? So,
Exactly.
that's obviously tough, but we do a lot of work with DISC and a lot of work with EQ. And so I think that, it's really important. If you have low emotional intelligence, you're going to struggle with this piece right off the bat, correct?
You're going to not want to hear about it.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not going to want to hear about it.
Yep.
I find it makes such a difference in terms of senior leaders, when it comes to strategic thinking.
Sure.
If you get a senior leader who is very open to learning and has very high EQ, if you will,
Yep.
Who says, gosh, I never knew there was a difference between strategic thinking and strategic planning and implementation. Yep. I thought it was all just strategy, and I just used the words interchangeably. You've got somebody who's going to be an absolute joy to work with. On the other hand, if you get somebody who says, there is really something wrong with my team, okay, these people don't know anything about strategy, and they don't know how to think strategically. I want you to come in and make them learn this.
And I'm not going to be there either. Julie, I'm not going to be there. You just take care of the team, right? Let me know when they're fixed, right?
You just bring your magic wand and make these
exactly.
people into strategic thinkers. And they don't realize that their role as a leader is as also a teacher. And the better they understand how people learn to think strategically, the better they're going to be able to teach through mentoring, through coaching, through modeling how to think strategically. And this is what it is. It's really inviting. Strategic thinking is really about inviting people to challenge your assumptions that are holding up the direction that you believe the organization should move into.
Sure.
So ego, emotion, it's a huge unspoken part.
Sure. Yeah. And, the people that already have the low EQ, you know what? Here's the deal, Julia. They've already turned the show off. So we're left with the good ones now, right? Exactly. So now we got the good ones. So let's just say, for the sake of the conversation, we've invested the time and energy to get the thinking aligned with where it needs to be. Step 2 then becomes the strategic planning. So I think that's probably where most people are a little bit more aware, but I'm shocked that 91 to 93% of strategic planning is never implemented. I mean, that's just scary, because I think of all the millions of dollars and millions of hours invested every year with all these off-site things, or half day this and full day that, and just to find out that this is kind of like our New Year's resolution that we, by 3 weeks into it, we don't know where our gym bag is, and we are, don't even go on the elliptical anymore or whatever. So what do you have some tips for somebody that we can help them make sure that they're part of the 7 to 9%, I'll call it, of people that do implement that strategic plan?
Oh my goodness, I do. I have so many tips.
Awesome.
Well, I think the first and probably the most important thing is to realize that strategic thinking is based on a very different kind of thinking than what strategic planning is. And to realize that you have a responsibility as a leader to signal to people which one of these 3 domains are you deliberately trying to move the team into.
Sure.
Because if you're confused, I guarantee you your team is going to be confused.
Right.
So I would say, being very conscious of and very deliberate and very intentional about what is your strategy domain. Which gear of the car are you trying to shift into
Sure.
is what it amounts to.
Okay.
Another thing is, I think that as a leader, another thing that is part and parcel of strategic thinking is that you need to really develop and really invest very heavily in your critical reflective processes. Critical reflective processes is kind of a bucket for critical inquiry and
Okay.
critical dialogue and critical reflection. And those are three things that you can work off on the side. You can work all year round on it. You can work on that. All three of those, critical inquiry, critical dialogue, and critical reflection, are really going to support this idea of inviting people to poke holes in your water balloon.
Okay.
So I think that's a huge thing. Another thing that is so important for anybody who's interested in developing and strengthening your own strategic thinking and that of your team
Sure.
is to be very conscious of what's the altitude, what I call the altitude. What's the altitude at which you're looking at this problem from? Are you being like a squirrel on the forest floor who's ruffling through the leaves and the nuts and everything on the forest floor? That's where we usually get stuck with strategic planning and with implementation.
Okay.
And then we tend to set a direction based on that. Or are you like a bird on the next branch up, or a higher branch or a higher branch? When we're able to consciously shift our altitude in terms of seeing a problem, it's just incredible how the mind kicks in. And we don't realize what we're doing is being critical of ourselves and our own thinking. And it's very playful. It's a playful exercise to do. It's also a very fun exercise to do.
Sure.
Another thing, if we take a look at the kinds of thinking that support strategic thinking as opposed to strategic planning, I tend to break these into two areas. One is, we all know strategic planning requires highly rational, linear, logical thinking. That's great. Hone those skills. My guess is probably almost every single person who's listening to this is super, super good at that. That's great. Hang on to it.
Sure.
But what's required of strategic thinking is what I call irrational thinking, which is highly intuitive and it's highly emotional. It's very, very visual. This irrational cluster of thinking that's required for strategic thinking is something that you can practice all year long and something that you can practice informally.
Okay.
But something we're not taught, and we tend not to be practiced in, is this whole cluster of thinking that supports strategic thinking, like intuition. I don't know about you, and I don't know about the listeners, but I know in my education background, intuition was really not even placed on the back burner. It was placed in a box with duct tape.
Yeah.
And you were basically told that it was completely irrelevant to anything that had to do with business. And that really couldn't be more untrue.
Yeah. Well, and so I have people that, like, it's like what does your gut tell you, right? I mean, that's kind of that intuition piece, and I asked that to somebody once, and they said, well, you don't want to know what my gut tells me if I had a burrito. So, I mean, it was one of those things that they didn't place a lot of, really stock in that spot. So I think you're bringing up a great point that we're really good logically. We're probably less good because there's not a lot of research, or there's probably not a lot of, substantiated evidence to prove my gut feeling. My gut tells me this, and it's like, well, is that really, should we be really, relying on somebody's gut feeling in some of those things? So I think it's great to have a balance of both, if I'm hearing that right from you then.
And I think as leaders, particularly in this particular environment in which people are being tasked with making strategy, something that's interesting to note, and I would encourage your listeners to kind of put a tag by this one, is that strategy itself is about setting direction. Okay, it's the key responsibility for leaders is to set the direction. And
Okay.
interestingly, strategy is guided by intuition and supported and legitimized by strategic planning. So it's guided by our intuitive thought and it's supported by our rational, linear, logical thought. It's
Huh.
exactly the reverse of what we're
Okay.
taught. So
Okay.
I think the lesson there is to really invest heavily and energetically in your intuitive thought.
Huh.
It's
Interesting.
to really invest very heavily in that because what we're taught from the time we're in primary school is to disregard it.
Yep. Well, and that's
Unless
funny. Oh, go ahead.
you're an
Yep.
artist,
Yeah.
you don't need your intuition. And when you're dealing with complex problems like real strategic problems, which are extraordinarily complex, the
Sure.
only way you're going to make any sort of innovative thinking is through this combination of irrational cognitions.
So I want to like, you don't mind a challenge, do you?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I'm thinking like if I'm a pilot and I don't look at my instruments, if I want to set my own course, because I know for myself, just in a car, I feel like I'm going west, but I'm really not. So how do we know when our intuition might lead us in a bad spot?
This is where you need to test your intuition with
Okay.
rational thinking.
Okay.
And then you need to test your rational thinking with intuition.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
you've really got two buckets, this irrational thinking and rational thinking. We really, as leaders,
Okay.
as strategic leaders, we really need to be very, very, very well honed and well polished in both of these. But the interesting thing is, we can't use both of them at the same time. Our brains doesn't function that way. You have to use one or you
Okay.
have to use the other. But it's what I call, it's cognitive fluency is what my aim is. My aim is
Okay.
to develop people's um, real strategic capacity and to their really support their strategic um, repertoire and their cognitive fluency so that people can shift from one to the other
Sure.
without
Okay.
skepticism and without doubt.
Okay. Well, so
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I find just by letting people know that,
Yeah.
especially in business where we all tend to be just, I know for myself, just zip, 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 zip. We're
Right.
so outcome driven
Yep.
that we often don't take a look at the deeper level of thinking to say, what can support me? I mean, clearly just being quick, 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 quick is not serving anybody when it comes to complex problems.
Sure. Wow, that's awesome. I wrote down something that I want to make sure that I understand, because when you were talking about the planning piece, I wrote down small course corrections versus large sweeping changes. So
Yeah.
if I was doing a strategic plan for a company, are they generally going to be more of these small course corrections throughout a year, we'll call it, or can it be some of those and also some really large, sweeping changes? I just see large sweeping changes being so hard to implement, and that's a lot of reason why we don't ever, we're part of that 91%. So I
Yeah.
didn't know if there was one success that you've seen over another.
This, you bring up a really, really interesting point that I'm guessing a lot of listeners are experiencing. I get this question lots of times is,
Sure.
should we go for the incremental changes? Should
Yep.
we go for the incremental changes or should we go for something that is like a tornado blowing
Yeah.
in?
Yep.
And it depends. It depends. If the short answer is, if it's a really complex problem, okay, a really complex problem where there's no playbook, there's no best practices, there's no
Sure.
single right, answer. There may be multiple possibilities. There's risk involved. There's
Yep.
tremendous risk involved. And whether you go incrementally or whether you change in something that's tornado fashion, is really about you, about your own risk threshold, your own risk tolerance, and that of the organization that you're working with. It's one of the reasons where it's just absolutely critical to engage in really intense strategic thinking for those sorts of things, because you may think, where you sit in the organization, it would be so much better to just, shake out all the flour, get rid of the bag, and start from scratch. But where other people sit in the organization, it may make no sense whatsoever to do anything but go incrementally and kind of scope it out to say, this is going to be a 10-year overhaul. And you're thinking 10 years, I'm thinking 10 hours. And let's just have a big bag and be done with it.
Hi, D, I got like 10 minutes here. Here's the deal, Julie. I got 10 minutes to fix this. So 10 years. I love it.
And so here we go. And then everybody else ends up dragging their feet because they say, oh, whatever, you know what? I wasn't included in this. I could have told him ahead of time. It wasn't going to work. Again, it's not the real problem. He doesn't have. And that's where we get the 91 to 93%.
Sure. Gotcha. So I have a question as we move into the strategic implementation. Is the group of people the same that are doing the planning and then doing the implementing? I mean, is there some handoffs that happen there? How, if you have any, ideas or thoughts on how to successfully turn, this plan into an action plan, so to speak, or turn it into something that actually happens?
This is $1 million question. This is so good. This is similar to the previous question. Should we go incrementally or should we do one big sweep? Ideally, when you look at the strategy triangle where we have strategic thinking, strategic planning, and strategic implementation, if our aim ultimately, which it should be, if our ultimate aim is successful implementation, people have to be involved in the strategic thinking piece in order to get a successful, detailed strategic plan in order to lead to successful implementation. And this is something that is so enormously time consuming, where most people don't even know the difference between strategic thinking and strategic planning. And all they realize is that they've had an unsuccessful implementation. And I think one of the ways to rectify that is to do some really slow, heavy lifting at the front end, which is the strategic thinking end, and include people. You want to include people who have very, very as different outlooks and perspectives as what you possibly can. It's kind of like I say, if you're ironing a shirt, go after all those little tiny wrinkles. Just really try and wrinkle those out in the front end. Don't wait until you're sitting in front of somebody's camera to try to get all the wrinkles out of your shirt. Do that at the front end.
Okay, awesome. So as we look at that implementation piece, our thoughts are aligned now. We're in good shape there. We've created this plan. I'm assuming it's a document of some sort. And now it's like, okay, now we have to implement this. And I've seen a lot of times, the business owners say, okay, here you go, have at it. Good luck. Let me know how it goes. Keep me posted on this. Maybe we'll do, quarterly check-in meetings, benchmarks or something like that, just probably more eyewash than anything else. But what tips do you have once you have that plan to make sure that it does get implemented? What does that third step look like for you?
That step is recurring strategic thinking. This is, I'm so glad you mentioned this. This is another point about strategic thinking, is strategic thinking can and should be used anytime, any place, anywhere by anybody. So it's an ongoing, continuous thing where, again, you're checking in. It's like you say, okay, so at some point, we've taken this water balloon, we've tested it, we're all on the same page that it's, going to float. Here, go take it and do whatever you're supposed to do with it. All along the way, you do need to come back and continue to test it. This is something that's rarely done. Again, it's time consuming, but it's critical. It's much better than having a big crash, at the end of the second quarter or at the end of the third quarter. It's much better to my aim is always to embed strategic thinking within the organizational culture,
Okay.
starting with the leadership team,
Okay.
either mid-level or senior level or C-suite, to really embed strategic thinking so that this whole idea of critical inquiry and critical dialogue and critical reflection, it's not a threat to your ego anymore. It's a test. It's
Yeah.
just a safety test is what it is, to say,
Okay.
we're floating this water balloon all over the place. Don't you think we ought to have some safety measures in place? And those safety measures are the strategic thinking.
So the implementation appears to be the easiest
It is.
because we've already done the heavy lifting. But I can also see where it's the hardest because it actually requires energy and it actually requires me to do something, So how do you I'm assuming if you haven't bought in on the strategic thinking, you're probably not going to buy in on the planning or the implementation, right?
Exactly. By the time, the whole purpose of strategy ultimately is successful implementation.
Okay.
And sometimes we kind of trip over ourselves and we get in such a great hurry for implementation because I think I know everything.
Yep.
And we get in a great hurry and we don't realize, it's like I'm in the driver's seat. I'm in the tractor seat. I'm in the driver's seat and I've got this wagon behind me. I'm assuming it's loaded and packed with people.
Right.
It's not okay for me not to turn around and check and to actually get out and go and check and see that everybody's got their legs in and their arms in before I take off and reach my destination and realize nobody was in the wagon to begin with, or they've all kind of fallen off along the way. So I think it goes back again to the triangle model where leaders have a responsibility to be cognitively fluent in all three of these, to make sure that if they really do want successful implementation, they're going to have a very meticulous plan in place that's going to have been rigorously tested through strategic thinking. So these three are so combined.
Yeah.
And I think the surest way of doing that is through knowledge, where good leaders simply need to know the breakdown of the three dots on the triangle model and take ownership for that.
Wow. And I think so the funny three words come up to me, and we talk about this a lot on the show is, ready, aim, fire. Where you get ready and then you aim and then you fire. Well, I tell you what, high D's in the disc, for me, I got it where I fire first, man. I ain't got time to, get ready. I don't have time to aim. I just fire, and I have to learn that, to implement without a plan or to implement without, the proper thinking at the beginning really is probably what you're seeing a lot in today's world of just do something. My parents said when I was little, don't just stand there, do something, So, we have that in our mind. And so I'm just curious if you have seen success in the implementation stage without the plan or without the thinking, or if it's just, it doesn't work.
I think there's an awfully lot of that today. A trend that's a very disturbing trend to me. Fortunately, it's a minor trend, but it's very disturbing to me, is because there's so much disruption in our business world today, in our world in general.
Sure.
I think a lot of people they're so frustrated, they're so exasperated, they're at their wits' end, where they're saying, you know what, whatever with strategy, we're throwing it out the window. We're not even going to bother with strategy. Right. We're just going to get out there and just do it. Yeah. If it works, it's like fail fast. Yeah. And if it doesn't work, we just get on to the next thing and again, fail fast. That's a very dangerous path, to go down, because it's very short term and it works well in a crisis
Sure.
situation
Yep.
because you have no other alternative or option. But
Right.
I think if you realize that in the environment in which we're working today, which is highly unpredictable, highly uncertain,
Hmm.
full of disruption, where when you know that real strategy tends to play at the intersection of all sorts of factors of disruption. Okay,
Okay.
you have an economic and a health intersection. Okay, an economic and a health intersection, and a social factor,
Okay.
and a political factor. That's where real strategy lives and plays.
Okay.
So it's going to be complex. It's going to be complex, and I think that if you take that perception of problems, of saying, what kind of a problem do I have here? Do I have a complex problem, which means there's no known solutions, there's no single right answer, there's no playbook, there's no best practices.
Sure. Sure.
We haven't been there before.
Yeah.
That kind of problem is a complex problem that requires complex thinking, like strategic thinking. If you
Gotcha.
have a problem that's just a complicated problem, I don't know the answer, you might not know the answer, but somebody somewhere knows the answer because there's a whole bunch of best practices, there are playbooks out there. That's going to guide your strategy. And I think the more complex your problem, the longer you're going to have to push that pause button,
Sure.
and the
Sure.
more you're going to have to engage in strategic thinking.
Well, but
And
isn't it the case though that whatever you do is still a strategy? I mean, you said do it, it's like do it. That's still a strategy, right? It might not be a smart one. It might not be a long-term one, but whatever we do, even doing nothing is still a strategy. It might not, again, be a successful one. So everybody listening, you're doing a strategy anyway. So why not invest the time to get your thinking aligned and then get your planning aligned so that the implementation ends up, successful. And so that's what I think is cool.
That's the ultimate aim.
Yeah.
And I think, what you just said is so, so critical. If I can go back to that.
Yeah.
This is where, when you look at strategy is both looking to the future, it's also looking backwards. If you look back, it's very easy to take a look at and see patterns that have formed, pattern recognition, which, even though people say, just do it, just try something, well, try something else. Looking back on strategy, you can see patterns, and we name strategies after patterns that we have realized and that we recognize. What we want to aim for is to get people to anticipate patterns for the future and to begin to plan strategies and make strategy around that. And that pattern recognition is really part of what really belongs in that domain of strategic thinking. That's a really, really, really tough thing to do.
Sure. Wow. There's so much here. We just barely scratched the surface. Is all of this, Julia, in your book? A lot of what we're talking about today, is that in your book?
Yeah, it is. It is
Okay.
probably in more detail than most people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we have 40 minutes worth of it. So obviously there's a lot more in the book. So, I think if you're listening and this is piquing your interest, I think one of the opportunities, would be to, grab a copy of this book, because obviously we can't do it justice in the time that we have today. But, there's so much here that I think, again, I appreciate what's been shared, because it's taken kind of the edge off of me from a strategic standpoint, because like I said, I still go back to, I can almost see myself as a 7-year-old trying to understand these moves on a chessboard. And my dad's been doing it for all these years, and he has this huge advantage that he's been doing it for all these years. But there are a lot of different strategies. And so I just never adopted those. I just was like, Dad, I don't want to do this. I want to go play catch. That's there's a whole lot more enjoyment for me in that. And then I've just kind of I kind of adopted that. Full disclosure, I mean, I've adopted that into my business career as well, where, I don't mind strategizing. I can say prior to this, I wasn't didn't have the strategic thinking in my mind. And I think that the culmination for strategy in my life prior to this wasn't the implementation. It was that having that really walk away from that strategic planning, feeling really good, and feeling like, oh my gosh, I accomplished a ton. And then I think the implementation was a lot weaker than it needed to be. So I greatly appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Oh, thank you.
So a couple questions, and then I'm going to let you go. Tip of the week. So what's Julia Sloan's tip of the week?
I would say my tip of the week is to remember that strategic thinking is different from strategic planning, and that strategic thinking is learnable. I think one of the biggest myths around strategy is people think that people are either born with it or they're not born with it. Yep. It's learnable. It's just that we tend to be so well practiced and so familiar with strategic planning, which is the whole instrumental mechanical kind of thinking, that strategic thinking, that whole irrational piece, freaks us out. It scares us. And the only reason it scares us is we don't know that it has value, and we don't know how to tap into it. So my tip of the week would be that strategic thinking is learnable.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So the second question, which is just as fun, but like totally off business, is if you want it to be. So what's one thing that the listeners wouldn't know about you that you feel comfortable sharing with them? They don't know this about you. So
I guess something that's completely unrelated to business, but something I so enjoy is, I guess, having spent so many years living in Asia, that I absolutely adore tea ceremonies, whether it's tea ceremony from Japan or tea ceremony from Thailand or tea ceremony in Mongolia or tea ceremony in China. I just absolutely love tea ceremonies and the whole everything around it.
Sure. Wow. And prior to this, I got to say, Julie, I would never even know there was a tea ceremony. So, so thank you for sharing that. So again, for the people, that are listening, hopefully this really kind of gave you a different perspective on strategy. Hopefully it allowed you to look at it, from a different view. And so if you have an interest, or you have more questions, that's why we do this every week. I want you to reach out to Julie. I want you to make that connection. I want you to be able to, grab a copy of her book, or I want you to ask her, some questions. I mean, I'm honored to ask the questions that help me. I take a bunch of notes every week, and I'm like, oh, this is great. So hopefully that has helped you, the listener, as well. So Julia, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, I'd be so pleased. They could go to learnstrategicthinking.com, or they could go to Julia at sloaninternationalconsulting.com, or they could, ring me up at 212-362-9455 if they wish as well. And
the phone number right to the doctor. I mean, this is like, how often do you get that? That's so cool.
Oh, I'd be so pleased.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Again, you took a really complicated, subject from a doctor's perspective and simplified it for a guy like me, that's what I try to do, is simplify it as best I can. And hopefully if I can get it, I know for sure my advanced educated listeners are going to be able to get it. So thank you so much for doing that, for breaking that apart for us, for helping me feel a little more comfortable with that word, because like I said, I've kind of, had a negative in my brain from little on. Because I always and I hate chess to this day.
I so get that. Because that's what has actually driven my research. Is I've worked in international strategy for many, many years, and when I entered, I had no idea what strategy was, zero. Yeah. And then I became very interested in it. And as I became interested in it, I thought, well, I actually need to figure out what it is. But I realized it's such a convoluted term. And I think a lot of it is because those terms are used interchangeably. And so I think when we can tease them apart, I find it really helps people a lot. So it's been such a pleasure here, Dave.
Absolutely. Well, you did a great job of teasing those apart for everybody. So again, feel free to reach out, to Julia and let her know, what's your question, have her help you, whatever you need. That's why we're here every week to do this. So Julia, thank you so much for investing time. We didn't get into any of the, other things that I wanted to. So I'm going to ask you back, and we're going to make sure that we pick this up where we left off. So thank you so much. And listeners, please go and understand the difference between strategic thinking and strategic planning. And if you still have a question, call her, call me. And all I'm going to do, if you call me, is give her her phone number. So, but you're more than welcome to call anytime. So thanks again, and look forward.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks so much. And thank you, listeners, so much.
Absolutely. Have a great day.